If you've ever thought that life can't surprise you after a certain age, let me tell you my story. I believed the same thing, that my life was settled into predictable routines, nothing more than familiar streets and faces. But then one invitation, one small decision to say yes, turned into an experience that changed the way I saw myself and the people around me. What started as a simple vacation with my neighbor became something far deeper, something I never could have imagined. Before I begin, I want to ask you something. From which city are you watching me today? I love knowing where everyone is tuning in from, because even though I'm sharing my own personal experience, I know these moments connect us all in surprising ways. So let me know in the comments while I share this part of my life with you. My name is Barbara. I'm 47 years old, and I've lived in the same neighborhood for over 15 years. I knew almost everyone in our quiet little suburban community, though most of those connections were surface level. We'd wave when passing by, exchange polite greetings at the mailbox, maybe comment about the weather while carrying in groceries. It was pleasant but not meaningful. At least, that's how it was until William moved in next door 3 years ago. William was around my age, perhaps a little older, 50 at most. He had kind eyes, a quiet way about him, and a subtle sense of humor that showed up in small, almost hidden remarks. For a long time, he was just the neighbor, but over time, small gestures began to build a bridge between us. When I was struggling to get a heavy box into my car, he appeared without me asking and lifted it with ease. On evenings when I was tending my garden, he paused to compliment the roses or offer a suggestion about how to keep the soil healthy. Our conversations grew longer, and eventually, our exchanges became something I looked forward to. Still, I never thought much beyond friendship. Life at my age comes with responsibilities and scars, and I taught myself to expect less and to settle into comfort. But then, one late spring afternoon, William asked me something I wasn't expecting. "Barbara," he said casually as we stood by our adjoining driveways, "I'm planning to take a little vacation to the coast next month. It's been a long time since I've really traveled. Would you maybe like to come along?" At first, I laughed. I thought he was joking. The coast? With him? I hadn't been on a true vacation in years. Work, family obligations, and everything in between always seemed to get in the way. But when I saw the sincerity in his eyes, I realized he meant it. "Are you serious?" I asked. "Absolutely. I think you could use it as much as I could. No pressure, of course. Just think about it," he replied, his tone light but his gaze steady. That night, I lay awake thinking about it. My practical side listed reasons why I shouldn't. It might be awkward. It could stir gossip among neighbors. It might not even be enjoyable. But there was another side of me, one that longed for something unexpected, something that broke through the dull repetition of my days. And the truth was, I trusted William. He had never been anything but respectful, kind, and genuine. So I said yes. The day of the trip arrived, and as soon as I stepped into his car, a strange mix of nerves and excitement filled me. William had thought of everything. He'd packed snacks, chosen a playlist with music that spanned decades, and even printed out directions, though the GPS was right there on his dashboard. "Just in case technology fails us," he said with a grin, waving the papers. The drive was long, but not once did it feel tiring. We talked about everything. Our childhoods, favorite books, even the regrets that still weighed on us. I told him how I sometimes wondered if I'd missed out on the chance to truly live, to take risks when I was younger. He listened with an attentiveness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. When we finally arrived at the little seaside town, the air was salty and cool, the sound of waves rolling in like a steady heartbeat. We checked into a small inn that looked like it had been standing for 100 years, with creaky wooden floors and lace curtains on the windows. My room was right across the hall from his. The first evening, we walked along the shoreline as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The sand was cool beneath my feet, and the breeze carried the scent of the ocean. William walked beside me quietly, hands in his pockets, until he suddenly said, "You know, I wasn't sure you'd actually agree to this. I'm glad you did." His words warmed me, and I smiled. I wasn't sure myself, but I'm glad too. We stopped at a small cafe near the pier for dinner, and over steaming bowls of clam chowder, we talked about life again. Only this time, the conversation took on a more personal, vulnerable tone. William shared how the past few years had been lonely since losing his wife. He wasn't bitter, just honest. I could see the mixture of sorrow and resilience in his eyes. I, in turn, admitted my own fears. That sometimes I felt invisible. That the world seemed to move faster than I could keep up, and I often wondered if anyone truly noticed me anymore. He reached across the table, just briefly touching my hand, not lingering, not crossing boundaries, but enough to let me know he understood. That night, back in my room, I found myself lying awake again. But this time, it wasn't worry keeping me up. It was a strange, comforting sense of possibility. The kind of feeling I hadn't experienced since I was much younger, when the future seemed full of open doors instead of closed ones. The next day was even more revealing. We explored the town together. Antique shops, old bookstores, quiet corners where locals gathered. He bought me a seashell necklace from a vendor, insisting it matched my spirit. I laughed at his choice of words, but when he fastened it around my neck, I felt a flutter I hadn't felt in years. By the afternoon, we found ourselves sitting on a bench overlooking the sea, the waves crashing against rocks below. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was full, rich, alive. And then William spoke softly, his voice almost lost to the wind. "Barbara, I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but being here with you has reminded me what it feels like to enjoy life again." I'd forgotten that. I looked at him, and in that moment I saw not just my neighbor, but a man who carried his own quiet strength and vulnerability. A man who had, without either of us planning it, opened a door to something new. I didn't know what the rest of the trip would hold. I didn't know if this was the start of something lasting or simply a fleeting connection. But what I did know was that I felt alive. And sometimes that's enough to begin with. Morning light poured through the lace curtains, drawing thin silver lines across the floorboards and over the suitcase I hadn't quite unpacked. I woke before the alarm because the ocean never really lets you sleep in. It nudges you awake with the hush of its breathing, like a steady reminder that time is moving. I lay there a few moments, listening, thinking about how yesterday had ended, William's quiet admission on the bench, the way it settled in my chest like a stone that wasn't heavy but grounding. There was a warmth in it, and also a tremble. I didn't know what to do with either, so I started with coffee. The inn's little breakfast room smelled like toast and oranges. A radio low in the corner played a station that could have been from any decade, the kind of soft, timeless music that fit the salt-stained windows and the framed photos of fishing boats along the wall. William was already there, a newspaper folded under his elbow, 2 mugs in front of him. When he saw me, he stood, that small, old-fashioned courtesy I'd almost forgotten existed. "Good morning," he said. "I wasn't sure how you'd take it, so I brought options." He had lined up little pitchers like a bartender, milk, cream, even oat milk he'd somehow charmed from the kitchen. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the effort touched me. I chose cream, and we ate quietly at first, not from awkwardness, but the kind of gentle silence that lets you notice small things. The sunlight made a halo of dust around his shoulder. A couple at the next table argued lightly about which lighthouse tour was less touristy. A gull outside tapped at the sill and looked offended when I didn't feed it a corner of my toast. "What would you like to do today?" William asked, setting down his mug. "I found a walking trail along the cliffs, and the bookstore on the corner opens at 10. The owner told me they have a section of travel journals. I thought you might like that." "You remembered I said I used to keep a journal," I said. "I listen," he replied, "and it wasn't boastful. It was just true." We started with the trail. The path wound up through a scrim of wind-bent pines, their needles calmed in one direction by years of weather. The ocean roared loud enough that words felt almost unnecessary, so we walked in rhythm, the crunch of gravel under our shoes and the call of distant gulls keeping time. When we reached a lookout, waves threw themselves against the rocks, white lace breaking into diamonds of spray. I stood near the railing, the breeze pulling my hair from its clip. "May I?" he asked, lifting a hand toward the stray strands. I nodded. He gently twisted the clip closed and lowered his hand. There was nothing rushed in the gesture. Somewhere behind us, a family laughed, children negotiating the sides of their bravery near the edge. Beside me, William didn't fill the space with commentary, and somehow that made the moment feel bigger. I realized how easy it is to talk over the feelings that are trying to tell you something important. We sat on a flat rock warmed by sun. He told me more about the years after his loss. He hadn't spoken much of the details before, how grief had rearranged his mornings, how he'd learned to make quiet peace with a life that suddenly had too much space. I listened, not offering solutions, because experience had taught me that grief isn't a problem to be fixed, but a landscape to be respected. When he finished, he looked out at the water a long time. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" "For letting me say it out loud to someone who won't turn it into a project." We headed back to town around noon, stopping for cold lemonade from a street cart. The man pouring it wore a knotted apron and the kind of smile that said he knew exactly how welcome his drinks were in the heat. We carried our paper cups to a bench and watched a group of teenagers practice tricks on battered skateboards. One of them fell, popped up, laughed at himself, tried again. It felt like a small parable about getting older. The body learns caution, but the heart still longs to try. The bookstore was a cool cave of wooden shelves and paper-scented quiet. A small bell announced our arrival, and a woman with gray curls and glasses nodded from behind the counter as if she were greeting frequent guests. We separated in that companionable way people do when they trust each other not to vanish. I found the travel journal section easily. Dog-eared field guides, notebooks with thick covers, slender diaries with ribbon markers. One, bound in faded blue linen, had a small brass clasp and a page at the front that said, "For the record of days you didn't want to forget." I held it, feeling the weight of possibility in my hands. William appeared at my shoulder, and I turned the book so he could see. "Buy it," he said softly. "It suits you." "I haven't written in years," I admitted. "What if I don't keep it up?" "Then it will hold a few very good days," he said, as if the measure of a life might be the precision of its moments rather than the span of them. We bought it, along with an old postcard of the town's pier at dusk. The shopkeeper slid the journal into a paper bag and tucked the postcard inside without charging for it. "A souvenir," she said, "from one recorder of days to another." In the afternoon, clouds gathered like a council over the water. The air changed, not colder, just expectant. By dinner, the first drops tapped the windows, and the inn's hallway lights blinked once, twice, then steadied. We chose the little restaurant across from the inn because it looked sturdy. the kind of place that had already stood through 100 storms. Inside, everyone spoke a bit louder and closer, as if to insist on the cheerfulness of walls and company against whatever the weather wanted to discuss. We ordered soup again, this time a tomato basil that came in thick, white bowls with handles. Halfway through, the power flickered and went out. A small cheer rose, and then candles appeared as if the room itself had been practicing for this. Someone produced an old battery radio, and music from some faraway station drifted in. The storm pushed at the windows, but the restaurant answered with clinking cutlery and a waitress who said, "Well, we'll just keep going, won't we?" William looked at me over the candle between us. The flame made a small, bright theater of his face. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am," I said, surprised to hear how true it sounded. "May I sit beside you?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space on my side of the booth. I moved over. He slid in, not quite touching me, leaving a respectful inch of air. The kind of space that says you are free to lean in if you want to, and you are free not to. The radio found a melody that might have been from our youth, something with a soft drum and a patience that modern songs seldom allow. A couple near the door began to sway, standing in a circle of candlelight as if they had conjured a ballroom out of rain and good humor. "Do you dance?" William asked, a smile in his voice. "I used to," I said, "very badly." "Then we'll match." We stood. The floor was sticky in places where someone had spilled a drink, and the candlelight made everything feel like a memory, even as it was happening. He held out his hand and waited. I placed mine in his. There was nothing urgent in the touch, just a steady warmth, the wordless courtesy of asking and answering and finding a shape together in time. We swayed. We laughed once when I stepped on his shoe. The storm threw a handful of rain at the window like coins. Somewhere, someone tried to harmonize with the radio and missed, and nobody minded. "Barbara," he said quietly, and I looked up. "May I hold you closer?" "You may," I said, and I moved into the space he offered. The permission mattered. The asking mattered even more. He drew me in gently, and I set my cheek against the fabric of his shirt. It smelled like clean cotton and a trace of aftershave, the kind that doesn't announce itself, but arrives like a remembered room. We didn't speak for a while. We didn't need to. The music did what it's always done for people like us, translating how the heart wants to stand with another heart without making promises it can't keep. When the song ended, we returned to the booth and found our soup still warm. The power blinked back to life, and a thin line of applause ran through the room as if the lights themselves had performed. We finished dinner, then braved the short dash across the street. The rain had slowed to a silk of mist. In the hallway, we paused between our rooms. The carpet smelled faintly of lemon cleaner. The wall sconce hummed softly. "Thank you for tonight," I said. "Thank you," he said, "for saying yes to all of it." He hesitated and then added, "May I hug you good night?" "Yes," I said. We fit easily, like two halves of a thought that had finally learned its sentence. When we parted, he didn't rush away or linger too long. He stepped back, and I felt the grace of that restraint almost as strongly as the embrace itself. Inside my room, I sat at the small desk and opened the blue journal. The first page felt like a lake at dawn, undisturbed, waiting for someone to decide whether to swim. I wrote about the storm, about the bookstore, about dancing badly and not caring. I wrote about the way William asked, every time, and how the asking made room for my answer to be fully mine. When I finished, I tucked the postcard of the pier behind the paper band at the front. For the record of days you didn't want to forget, it had said. I was starting to assemble a small archive. The next morning, the world was scrubbed and bright, the kind of clean that happens only after the sky has had its say. We rented bicycles with wicker baskets and bells that made a pure little sound. We rode along the boardwalk at a leisurely pace, nodding at early walkers and dogs that looked proud of their humans. At a corner where the wind gathered, William stopped and pointed. Below the railing, a narrow set of steps led down to a cove I hadn't noticed, half hidden, a small amphitheater of rock and sand where the tide left its secrets. "Let's see what the water brought in," he said. On the beach, the morning's treasures lay in a ribbon along the line where the waves had sighed out. Pale driftwood, sea glass shaped like gumdrops, shells stippled with tiny ferns of pattern. I crouched and found a small, smooth piece of green glass, edges dulled by time and travel. I held it to the light, and it glowed like a held leaf. "Here," William said, and when I turned, he was holding a flat stone about the size of my palm. In the center, nature or luck had drawn a pale heart. Not perfect, the way hearts never are, but unmistakable. He placed it in my hand and didn't make a speech. Some gifts don't require narration. We sat on a low rock and watched a fisherman in a yellow slicker cast his line with patient ritual. William cleared his throat, the way people do when they want to say something carefully. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "I don't want to rush anything. But I also don't want to pretend this is just a pleasant trip we'll forget next week. Would you consider, when we go home, letting me take you to dinner? Not as neighbors who share a fence. As two people who met beside the ocean and decided to keep talking. The simplest questions can be the hardest. They carry a history in them. I thought about my house, the routine I'd built like a fortress, the version of myself that had learned to be safe rather than surprised. I thought about the feeling of being seen without being solved. I looked down at the heart on the stone, irregular, weathered, a shake made by pressure and time. "Yes," I said, "I would like that very much." He exhaled a little, laughed under his breath, as if he'd been holding a note longer than he'd meant to. We didn't seal it with a kiss, not then. We sealed it with a plan. A date at the diner on the corner back home, the one with the good lemon pie, next Friday at 7. Sometimes the promise of an ordinary evening is the most romantic thing you can set on a calendar. On our last evening, the town unfurled a sky so generous with color it felt almost brazen, lavenders and persimmons, the sun drawing a last hot line along the horizon. We returned to the pier from the postcard, because good stories like to circle where they began. People leaned on the railing in pairs and ones, all of us attending the same quiet ceremony. A child asked an earnest question about whether the sun gets tired. A man in a red cap answered with authority, even though he had no idea. The water made its old pledges. "May I hold your hand?" William asked. "Yes," I said, and our fingers found the simple, ancient way of being together. We stood like that through the end of the light, and when the first evening star made itself known, I felt the surprising ease of it, the way my life, which had seemed so set, suddenly had room again. Not because anything had been taken away, but because something had been added, not drama, not frenzy, just a line of music I could hum as I walked home. We didn't rush goodbyes the next morning. We packed slowly, stopped for coffee, thanked the innkeeper whose smile said she'd seen these beginnings before. The drive back was quieter than the drive out, not from sadness, but from a fullness I didn't want to dilute with chatter. We pointed out small things to each other, the hawk making lazy circles above a field, the roadside stand selling peaches, the way the clouds arranged themselves like pages in a book. When we pulled into our street, the familiar map of home unfolded. The jacaranda that sheds purple confetti in spring, the slightly crooked mailbox I keep meaning to fix, the neighbor's dog that pretends not to like anyone and then leans hard against your shin. Standing by our cars, We met each other's eyes the way you do when you are grateful and a little astonished. "I'll see you Friday," he said. "I'll be the